Alright, hello guys. Today we are talking all about testing mountaineering fitness. So we're going to be diving deep into assessments and tests that a mountaineer can use to judge their progress over time. Now the reason why I want to talk about this today is testing fitness is a pretty interesting subject in the sense that most of us know it's relatively important. Most of us know it's a good idea to know whether or not we're improving or not. But in all honesty, the information available around fitness assessments and testing to the general population is pretty rubbish. And then when it comes to the mountaineering population, there really isn't a huge amount. There's one particular set of fitness tests a mountaineer might go through, but in all honesty, in my opinion, they do have a few drawbacks and they're definitely not covering everything. And I think there's a lot more room to explore on this particular subject. So today we're going to be diving into it deep around how to figure out what type of assessments you might use to judge your progress, a few of my favorites, and we're going to be leading into lower body assessments, upper body assessments, and core assessments as well. Now this is going to be a two-part episode. Today I'm going to be talking around the basics around of assessment and testing, as well as my favorite lower body assessments, and then the next week's episode we're going to go into upper body and core. But essentially, when it comes down to why you would think about testing and assessments, is mountaineers tend to do, a reasonable amount of training. They're not, you got a big adventure coming up, you don't want to be knackered on the mountain, you want to be prepared, and mountaineers are pretty happy to go out and do a reasonable amount of training hours. But the fact is, if you're putting this time into your training and you're not sure whether or not you're improving, and you're not sure where you're improving, you're really not making the best use of your time. You're potentially missing out on huge benefits, and you're not going to be knowing when to change your training or whether or not things are working. And the quote that I absolutely love in this situation is, if you're not testing, you're just guessing. And when it comes to guessing for your training, it's not really a good idea. Now, when it comes to assessments and tests, they can be a really powerful tool to judge both progress, to see if you are moving forward, if you are getting fitter, if you are getting stronger, if you are progressing and your training's doing the right things. But it can also be a great motivation as well. Many people love watching numbers go up. They love beating their PBs. They love beating times in their runs. And it can be a really good motivator over the long term as well, particularly if you're one of the diligent people who like to test and they can look over years worth of testing and just see just how far you've come. Oof, it is crazy how good that can feel. But when it comes down to testing, they can be very, very simple or can be very, very complex. Now, a mountaineer is probably relatively familiar with the complex side of things. They've heard about lab testing, they've heard about self-assessments where they're doing tracking heart rates and yada yada. But you can also be very, very simple as well. It doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be outrageously complicated. It really depends on what fits better into your life. For me, I personally like simple assessments. I think 99% of mountaineers out there are going to be best benefit from simple assessments. The more complex stuff, the more, scientific, you could say, stuff. It is good, and if you can get around it and you enjoy that, it is good. But unless you're really chasing minute improvements, like you're a professional athlete who's trying to take 2 seconds off your time or whatever it may be, there might be a bit of overkill and they're not strictly necessary. But that's my personal opinion. I like simple. But anyway, we're going to be going through today essentially what makes a good assessment for mountaineers. Today we're going to go through a few methods of assessing aerobic fitness. And as I said before, next episode we're going to go through lower body strength, upper body strength, and core endurance. So today we're going to be focusing on the aerobic side of things. So essentially when you're looking at assessments, there are a few key areas you really need to focus on, or you really need to tick off to ensure you're having a good assessment. Now, number one is that a good assessment needs to be specific, and it needs to be specific for your particular goals as a mountaineer. Now, this is something that so many people miss and something the fitness industry is absolutely terrible about, because there are hundreds and hundreds of different fitness assessments, but there are probably only a handful that are going to be relevant for a mountaineer and their particular goals. Now, a classic example of this is the old beep test, which I see all the time, and I have seen mountaineers discussing this. And this is, if you don't know what it is, it's something that a lot of people do in high school, in which you go back and forth, running a 10 meter back and forth in a straight line, and essentially a beep's telling you timing. And a beep just gets quicker and quicker and quicker over time, and every level it gets quicker. And essentially you just keep on speeding up, and eventually you won't be able to go any further, and that's your level and your assessment. Now, that might be relevant for testing high school, participants as a mass group, but that's got no relevance for mountaineering. It's pretty obvious you're not doing stop and start, you're not working at that intensities, you're not progressively increasing your pace or anything like that. So while it can be a good number, it's not relevant for mountaineers. And there's many things out there. So first of all, you do need to think, is this particular assessment that I'm going to do, is that specific to my mountaineering goals? Number two, a good assessment needs to be easily measurable. Now, when I say that is, when you're doing assessments, you need to be able to getting some type of objective data out of it. So usually some type of numbers, whether it's weights, whether it's time, whether it's heart rate, something that's very objective, and it's not just a feeling. If you're rolling into an assessment and you do a run one day and then 8 weeks later you do the same run and you're like, oh, that felt a bit easier. Yeah, it might be easier, but it's not an effective assessment. It's not going to work for you. Now, I'm not saying you have to measure all your training, and I'm not a huge believer in tracking every little bit of your training, but when it comes to assessments, you do. It's just pure and simple. There's no getting around it. If you're assessing and you're not having a clear number in the outcome, it's not worth your time. Number three, an assessment needs to be repeatable. Now, the reason I say this is you 100% need to choose an assessment which you can repeat the exact same assessment, the exact same conditions, the exact same criteria every single time you do it, or it's just not going to be valid, it's not going to be useful, and it's not going to be reliable. Now, a classic example of this is a standard mountaineering fitness assessment is the timed incline ascent, where a mountaineer will whack on a pack, they will choose a certain amount of elevation, and they basically go out and try to get that elevation done in the shortest time possible. And that's a great assessment for a number of reasons, but that is only going to be applicable if you can repeat that same assessment and that same climb every single time. Now, if you happen to do the first time you did the assessment in your local hometown, and then 12 weeks later you're assessing again, but you happen to be in a different country or away on a work trip, and you did a similar trail, which was maybe the same grade, maybe the same elevation, and it was pretty similar, it's still not going to be valid. It's not going to be right. It has to be the same conditions. So you need to either need to choose local assessments, which you're going to do in your hometown again and again and again, or alternatively, universal assessments in which you can do anywhere in the world, which is going to have the same criteria. So for example, if you are always traveling, maybe a timed ascent isn't going to be your best bet, and maybe you should just do box steps in the gym or something like that. You also need to be really clear on the outlines of what's acceptable and what are the specific things you need to be doing in this workout. Now, a classic example of this is an old gym I used to work at, and they used to do these fitness assessments every 12-16 weeks. And there's a lot of trekkers and mountaineers in there, but also a lot of general population as well. And basically they did all these assessments, and they were just doing this mishmash of exercises which you repeated as quickly as you can. And so you do push-ups, you do pull-ups, you do sled push, and yada yada, and you bang them all together and do it as quickly as you can. Not an amazing assessment, but it's good enough for what it was. But the issue there was there were people, the specific outlines of each exercise were not enforced every single time, and they were different every single time. For example, push-ups. Push-ups, the range and the depth of those changed each time people tested. So one time they might be doing push-ups chest to the floor, the next time they might just be doing half push-ups. The same thing with pull-ups. One time they might be doing full pull-ups with the arms straight, the other time they might have been doing 3/4 pull-ups. And that wasn't enforced, and that wasn't strict, and that wasn't clear. So again, the outcomes were just not reliable, they were not valid, and it was just not a good method of assessing progress. So if you are doing, for example, strength assessments, you need to be really clear. What is an acceptable repetition? What is the range you need to be doing? And it needs to be super clear. The next thing is a good assessment really does need to be simple. Now, if you are looking at an assessment and you are getting cross-eyed from the criteria and the methods, and you're like, oh my gosh, I do not understand this. It's like trying to decipher another language. It's not for you. You've got two options there. Number one, you either need to outsource this, whether it's to a coach or an exercise physiologist or whatever it may be, so they can run you through the assessment, or you can find a simpler one, and one that doesn't turn you cross-eyed. It's as simple as that. The next up is a good assessment has to have minimal risk of injury. Now, that should be a massive priority when it comes to assessing your fitness and your strength, because you don't want to be putting yourself at risk of injury here. You don't want to be doing silly exercises or doing something that's just unnecessary, because if something does go wrong and it ends up impacting your training, that is just an absolute nightmare, and we do not want this. Now, a classic example of this is 1RM testing. So in the gym, when you're doing your maximum lifts for one repetition, whether it's your squat, your deadlift, your bench press, or whatever it may be, it's not relevant for mountaineers. It's not necessary. It's not a great idea. And unless you come from a powerlifting background where you've done multiple 1RMs in your life and you're super confident with it, as a mountaineer, you do not need to be doing 1RMs. They just the risk just so far outweighs the rewards on that, and there are much better ways of judging your assessment, judging your strength, which is going to have much lower risk of injury than getting under a bar and trying to lift your 1RM. So we'll dive into that a little bit later, but that's a classic example. The same thing as another assessment I've seen from mountaineers somewhere in the wide world was doing a 30 or 60 minute box jump test, in which they'd put the timer on and do as many box jumps as they could in 30 or 60 minutes. Now, that may be a relatively decent judge of muscular endurance, and it may have some relevance to aerobic fitness, but that amount of impact, that amount of fatigue on jumping exercises, it's crazy. It's just not smart. And something like that is just not safe. So when you're looking at assessments, you just got to think, is this putting me in a potential to hurt me? If it is, you probably want to find something else. And then finally, to make a good assessment, is you really do need to identify any potential weaknesses and blind spots which might affect both your training and your time on the mountain, and not just your strengths. Now, the classic example here is mountaineers are the few fitness assessment that mountaineers often see. 75% of the strength testing is around quadricep strength, which is mental. Now, obviously, there's a lot more muscles going on in the legs, and mountaineers as a whole tend to have pretty strong quadriceps, but people just love testing them, whether it's through box jumps or squats or step ups or whatever it may be. Yes, it is relevant, but you also need to be testing areas which may be weak or may be a blind spot. So classic example, are you testing your glutes and your hamstring strength? If you're not, you're going to be missing out. And you really do need to make sure that you're looking at all the areas around the body and treating it as a whole, and not just testing things that you're good at. So there are a few criteria to make a good assessment, whether you're going to pick one off the internet, pick one off today, create your own, or whatever it may be. It needs to be specific, easily measurable, repeatable, simple, minimal risk of injury, and designed to identify any potential weaknesses, blind spots, not just strengths. So now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to cover aerobic assessments and talk you through a few different options as a mountaineer, what you can do when you're judging your aerobic fitness. Now, obviously, with mountaineering, we all know that aerobic fitness and your aerobic capacity is the single most important element of fitness that you can possibly develop as a mountaineer, and is the most crucial thing you need to be working on. So making sure you get an accurate measure of whether or not you're improving that is very, very important. So there are a few different ways you can go about measuring your aerobic fitness, depending on what fits into your life and what are your preferences. The first one is a set distance, in the sense that you're going to choose a set distance, whether it's a certain amount of elevation, a certain distance you're going to run or hike, or a certain amount of steps or whatever it may be, and you're just going to do that as quickly as you can. You're not going to be worrying about intensity or anything like that. You're just going to smash it out. So whether that's a 10k run, whether that's a 1,000-foot step test, whether that's a 1,000 meters of elevation climb, whatever it may be, it's purely a set distance. You just bang it out. The second option is a set time. So you set yourself 30, 40, 60 minutes, and you simply just climb, step, run, hike, whatever it may be, and you do that for that amount of time. You track how far you can get in those 40 minutes or 50 minutes or 60 minutes. And then 8 weeks later, you'll do the same timing, and then hopefully you'll get further in that same time, meaning you've gotten fitter. Pretty straightforward. Another option is a set pace. So this one is essentially trying to limit you down into, as opposed to going as hard as you can and really, really pushing those limits of, potentially your anaerobic energy. What we're doing here is limiting your pace So you're working 100% or mostly in your aerobic energy zones, which we do as mountaineers, and you're just going to try and do a distance and see how far it takes you. Now, a classic example of this is doing a 5 or 10 kilometer run and just purely sticking to nose breathing. So you can only run at a nose breathing pace, and you time how long it takes you to get those 5 or 10 kilometers. Or if you love your heart rate, you can do 75% of your max heart rate, which will give you, a rough estimate, a pretty good estimate of where you need to be. And you literally maintain 75% of your max heart rate. You don't really dip lower or higher than that, as close as you can for that entire 5 kilometers, and you time it. Then next time around, 8 weeks down the line, you do the same thing, stick to nose breathing or stick to 75% of your max heart rate. And if you've been doing the right things in your training, you will be able to get through that 5 or 10 kilometers much faster, even though you're working at the same intensity. So that's a really great measure. And then the final way of sort of assessing your aerobic fitness is going and doing the lab testing, which I'm sure many mountaineers are familiar with. So whether you're booking with a physiologist or whatever type of access you have, you do a gas exchange test, a VO2 max test, blood lactate testing. That stuff is super accurate and it's very, very beneficial. But in all honesty, for most people, it's not strictly necessary. It can be a bit of a hassle going back to, finding one in your local area. It can be relatively expensive, and then a lot of the data for the average mountaineer, it might not be very useful, in all honesty. It can help you, but it might be a bit of overkill. If you love that type of thing, absolutely go right ahead. But for most people, as I said, I like simple, and I think you don't really need it. Now, you might do that, and I do recommend my mountaineers often do that as a one-off thing initially when you're starting your training, to figuring out your training zones if they need a bit of direction there, and then maybe doing it further down the line, maybe once again in their preparations. It's not strictly necessary, but that's something how you may use it. So that's my opinion there, but everyone's a little bit different. Now, when it comes down to my favorites, what I generally do for my mountaineers and what assessments I do, I like to do 2 different aerobic assessments, depending on obviously availability and time and all of that jazz. But number 1, I like to do the 1,000 foot or the 305 meter step test, which was created by the guys at Uphill Athlete, which is fantastic, super simple. You can do it absolutely anywhere, whether it's at home, in a gym, outdoors, whatever it may be. And it's essentially finding yourself a step, which is about halfway up to 3/4 up the shin. So it's not too high. And you're going to put a loaded pack on your back. So whether it's anywhere from 10 to 15% of your total body weight or whatever it may be, you're going to measure out the step, and then you're just going to do as many steps as you need to do to make out the equivalent of 1,000 feet or 305 meters. And you're just going to time that and see how long it takes you. And then 8 weeks, 12 weeks further down the line, you're going to do it again, and hopefully you get more. It's going to take less time, I should say. So really simple. You can do that anywhere. Very, very effective. Very, very relevant for mountaineers, and it can give you a pretty good judge. The other side of things, I like that 5 kilometer nose breathing run, which I mentioned before. So essentially what you do is you choose a 5 kilometer track, and you've already judged how far it is. You just make sure your mouth stays closed through this entire run, and you time how long it takes you. Next time you test, you do exactly the same run. Keep that mouth closed again, time how long it takes you. And if you do it quicker, you're on the right track. So essentially, those are my favorites with aerobic assessments. As I said, there's so many options out there, and I gave you a few ideas around how you can sort of create your own, whether you're doing the set distance, the set time, the set pace, or you go into the lab testing. You can get really creative with this, but as long as you follow those rules before that I mentioned when you're making them up for yourself, you should be on the right track. It really works out what's not beneficial, I should say, what's realistic that you're going to fit into your life, what's convenient, and then you go from there. So that's part 1 of this testing mountaineering fitness episode done. So thank you for listening. I hope you got a little bit of insight around that. I hope that all made sense, and I hope you're sort of getting your head around. There's a little bit more thought that goes into fitness testing for mountaineers than you may have first thought. If you do want anything clarified on this, please do reach out to me. Find me on Facebook or Instagram. Shoot me a message. I'm always happy to talk about this. But part 2, we're going to be diving into strength assessments, so lower body, upper body, and core endurance assessments, and how you can work that out. Now, if you were wanting help with your mountaineering fitness, and you were wanting help judging whether you're progressing or whether you've been doing testing and you're realizing you're not going anywhere, I would love for you to come and check out the online summit program, which is my online personal training service for mountaineers. You can find that at summitstrength.com.au/online-mountaineer, and I'll leave a link in the show notes below. You can check it out, see all the inclusions, but it's a fantastic option for any mountaineer in training. So thank you so much for listening today, guys, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.